Gillie is unveiling shocking details on his podcast $1 Million Worth of Game, recounting a conversation with the police that would rock anyone's core. They told him that the Philadelphia area teen basketball prodigy Noah Scurry was responsible for the tragic death of his own son YNG Cheese. A 25-year-old rapper, YNG Cheese, was killed in a senseless drive-by shooting in June 2023, in what seemed to be a case of wrong place, wrong time. However, the revelation that Noah, a young basketball star, had reportedly been the triggerman in the murder stunned everyone and cast a dark shadow on an already heartbreaking loss. Gillie, a longtime staple in the hip-hop scene and one of the most recognized voices in Philadelphia, spoke candidly about the unsettling news on Club Shay Shay with Shannon Sharpe. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Gillie explained how the police had reached out to him after Noah's death in January 2024, telling him that the investigation had linked Noah Scurry to the shooting. They shared that the authorities had been closing in on Scurry, ready to arrest him for the murder of YNG Cheese just as Noah's own life was tragically cut short in front of his own home. The shooting of YNG Cheese, according to Gillie, was never meant to target him directly, but he had simply been in the wrong place when the gunfire erupted. A senseless tragedy. But the real heartbreak came when Gillie learned that Noah, the once promising young athlete who was on his way to possibly achieving greatness in basketball, had seemingly become entangled in a life that would ultimately lead to his demise, and even worse, possibly contributed to the death of Gillie's son. This wasn't just another story about street violence. It was a window into the dark underbelly of Philadelphia's urban environment, where young men like Noah were being swallowed by a system that left few opportunities for escape. As Gillie began to speak more about his interactions with the police, the sadness in his voice was undeniable. He had always been honest about the harsh realities of life in Philadelphia, but to hear that a young man so full of potential had become a part of the deadly cycle of violence was a devastating blow. To make matters worse, Noah had been showing signs of falling deeper into the world of drill rap, a genre often associated with street violence and gang culture. The reveal that Noah had been moonlighting as a drill rapper, donning a Joker mask and embracing the persona of a violent and rebellious figure, sent shockwaves through the hip-hop community. The rapper-turned-basketball star had released his first solo drill song just days before he was murdered. The song, released on January 13, 2024, seemed to encapsulate the anger and frustration of the streets, but tragically, the very next day, he was shot dead in front of his own home. It was almost as if Noah's embrace of this persona had sealed his fate. In many ways, he had become a symbol of the dangers that accompany fame when it's tied to a dangerous lifestyle. Gillie's voice grew heavier as he reflected on the loss of his son and the escalating violence plaguing the streets of Philadelphia. "I've seen this story play out 1,000,000 times, man," he said. "It's the same thing every time. Promising kids with futures, they get lost in the streets and it's over before they even get started." Noah wasn't any different. He had all the potential in the world, but that life, it pulls you in. Takes everything from you. Gillie's own son, YNG Cheese, had never been a part of that world, or so it seemed. But that night, he had been in the wrong place when the bullets flew. It wasn't meant for him, Gillie said, but when you live in a city where violence is part of the landscape, it can find you anywhere. YNG Cheese was just a kid, man. He wasn't caught up in that life. He was on his grind, trying to build his career, make a name for himself. But the streets don't care, Gillie continued. It was that very fact, the reckless, senseless violence that claimed so many lives in Philadelphia, that pushed Gillie to speak out. He had seen firsthand how these streets were breeding grounds for more victims, more children whose dreams were being erased before they could even fully begin. And Noah was one of those victims. A gifted basketball player with the highest SAT scores at his school, Noah had a future ahead of him, yet he chose to dive headfirst into a world that would eventually take it all away. As the investigation into both YNG Cheese's murder and Noah Scurry's tragic end began to unfold, it became evident that these young men were not just victims of circumstance, they were products of a system that had failed them. Gillie's anger and frustration became palpable as he ranted about the pressures faced by today's youth. The streets, man, they put everything in front of these kids. They make them think this is the only way. You can't blame the kids. It's the system, it's the environment they're in. They got no other options, and when they're faced with that kind of pressure, they take what they can get. And most of the time, it's a dead end. Gillie went on to describe how the culture in Philadelphia, one shaped by violence, poverty, and systemic neglect, had created a breeding ground for young men to make the wrong choices. The streets offered a false sense of belonging, a sense of respect, but at what cost? For Noah, it was his life, and for Y&G Cheese, it was his future. Gillie spoke of how he had seen too many talented kids like Noah, kids like Y&G Cheese, lose their lives to the streets. And the tragedy was not just in their deaths, but in the fact that they never even had a chance to break free. The interview took a somber turn when Gillie spoke about how he saw Noah's future unfolding before him, despite the young man's choices. "I saw the signs. I saw it all. Noah was slipping. I could see it in his music, his posts, the people he was hanging around. That's the thing, man. Once you're in too deep, it's hard to pull yourself out. And once the streets have you, there's no going back." Shannon Sharp, who had been listening intently, responded with empathy, acknowledging the depth of Gillie's pain. "I can't imagine what it's like to lose a son like that. To know that your son didn't deserve it, that he was taken away because of something that wasn't his fault. And now you're dealing with the reality that this other kid, someone who should have had a chance at greatness, is also gone. It's tragic all around." Gillie nodded, but his expression remained stoic. He had lived through enough to know that tragedy was a part of life. But what hurt the most was knowing that both of these young men, the one who killed and the one who was killed, had so much potential, so much to offer the world. And it was all taken away because of a cycle of violence that didn't care who they were or what they could have become. There was no winner here. No one came out of this situation unscathed. The families, the friends, the community, everyone lost something. And as the podcast interview concluded, Gillie's final thoughts echoed a sentiment that hung heavy in the air. At the end of the day, it's the streets that win. And nobody wins when the streets win. This wasn't just a story about violence or death. It was a reflection on the devastating impact of systemic inequality, failed opportunities, and the harsh reality that some young people face when there are no other choices. Gillie's words, raw and unfiltered, underscored the complexities of growing up in Philadelphia, a city where survival often trumps everything else. As Gillie continued to reflect on his son's death and the loss of Noah, he emphasized the need for change, both within the community and in the way society viewed its youth. "We have to do better for these kids," he said. "They're not bad people. They're just products of their environment. And until we start giving them real options, until we start giving them a chance, we're going to keep seeing stories like this over and over again." It was a call to action, a plea for change, and a reminder that there were no winners in the cycle of violence that had claimed the lives of so many promising young people. It was a lesson that, unfortunately, too many had to learn the hard way. And as the interview came to a close, the sadness in Gillie's voice remained, a reminder of the toll that violence and systemic failure take on the individuals caught in its grip.